Hey everybody, hope you're having a good day. I'm going to talk a little bit and try to do this as quickly as possible about that period where change gives birth to existential suffering, existential lament, and I called it the anguished cry. And what I'm talking about is when something happens that just comes completely out of the blue, and it's a big sea change, major change that really just rocks your world in every dimension. And think about this holistically. As somebody who is a thinking person, a feeling person, somebody who's in a body, obviously, somebody's in a relationship. Every dimension of life gets slapped by this thing that happens and just knocks you for a loop. It knocks your feet out from under you. It shakes the foundations with under you, and it's a horrendous place to be. And if you look at it from all of those different perspectives, psychologically, emotionally, what you relationally, behaviorally, bodily, what you see is chaos. It's like you don't know where to turn. You don't know what to do. You don't know who to call. You just blown away. And often under those circumstances, and you have seen this, maybe experienced this yourself, that when a person is in intense pain or intense suffering, whatever its form, one of the things that intense pain and suffering does is to resist language. And this is a little insight I picked up from reading a book called The Body in Pain by Elaine Scarry. And it's a very good point that when you are in intense pain, when you're in that moment of shock, language escapes you. You can't describe where you are. And so the language of that kind of experience is tears, and it's moaning, and it's crying, and it's this agonized cry. And it may just come out with nothing more than, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, right? That's just all that can come out. So that's the first part of it. There's no way to really adequately articulate the pain and the suffering that you're feeling in a moment like that. But you tend toward wanting to express it. And here's the problem. This goes back to Elaine Scarry as well, is that when you are in pain, you know you're in pain. She says it's the epitome of certainty, that when you are in pain, you know you have pain, and you know the intensity of that pain. But when you articulate that in language, when you can finally find some way to articulate that to someone else, they don't always get it because they can't feel the pain that you feel. And so your pain for yourself, if you have a toothache, you're certain of that toothache, and you go to describe it to the other person, they're not necessarily doubting that you have a toothache, but they can't possibly imagine how your toothache feels to you. And what that does, it tends to throw us back on ourselves, compounds our suffering, and it induces loneliness. So very often the experience of pain and suffering, especially in these initial stages, is marked by loneliness. And I don't mean to imply that it's only there, but it's at least there. But it doesn't matter what any of us suffer, in a sense, existentially speaking. We always suffer alone. If I have a bad cold, I may give you the bad cold, but it doesn't make my cold any better since I gave you part of it, right? And so it's like you can sympathize with me, you can have compassion for me, you can help look after me, but you can't fully know what it is like for me to be sick. If you have been there before, then maybe you have a better understanding, but you will never completely know precisely how it feels to me, just as I'll never completely know how it feels for you. And see, it's very difficult to stay in that position. Nobody wants to sit in agony. Nobody wants to live in the period of the anguished cry. And so what we try to do, what we start doing, is creating some sort of structure to manage this. And see, this conversation that I keep hinting at, and some of you keep pressing upon, this notion of form. In a sense, form flows out of the anguish cry. It's the anguish cries desire to get some degree of control over what is going on. And I was reading a book by Douglas Groothuis that I would highly recommend to you, called Walking Through Twilight. And Groothuis wrote this book. He's a philosopher, Christian philosopher, teaches in Colorado Christian University, I think. And his wife, who was brilliant, developed a rare form of dementia. And he wrote this book about living with his wife and watching her decline over a period of years. And it's really one of the most touching books you'll ever read on caregiving to somebody who is really, really failing. It wasn't Alzheimer's, it was another kind of dementia. And anyway, he says, that people tend to kind of start ordering their suffering along two lines. And again, these are models. All models are limited, okay? And so Bergman's model is limited. My little model about change and anguish, it is limited. It's just a way of kind of getting some fix on what we're talking about. So he says people tend to do one of two things. They tend to fall on the side of pessimism, or they fall on the side of optimism. It's just people in general. I'm not talking about believers necessarily here, although believers do this too. So if you fall on the side of pessimism, and if you'll excuse my language, before I say this, pessimism and optimism are not just states of consciousness. They're not just cognitive things. They are that, but they're not just that. It's a commitment to how you understand life. This is the way life is. This is the way history is. And pessimism is the belief that things will never get better. And that, as I started to say, if you'll excuse my French, life is one damn thing after another. And you might get some respite here and there, but you just become Eeyore. It's just one bad thing after another. And that's a commitment to see to a view of history. But on the other hand, the optimist has a different view of history. The optimist says, well, I'm in agony right now, but the sun will come out tomorrow. They sing Annie. That history itself always tends toward getting better. And that though I cannot do much right now, I know that tomorrow will be a better day, that this too will pass, and what it will pass into is something better. But see, both of those accounts depend upon a view of history, how history goes. It either goes, one thing after another, down, 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 or it goes one step, further and further toward a better day. In addition to that, and I don't think Groothuis said this, I don't know, maybe I came up with this, I don't know. But it seems to me in my experience that people, so that's a view of history, but there's also a kind of way that people adjust to that. And one way is that they become passive. And so if I'm suffering and it's always just one dadgum thing after another, right, then I become passive to that and I just ride the flow of pessimism, right? Or I ride the flow of optimism. I don't necessarily take any action myself. I just wait for the next shoe to fall, or I'll wait for that sunlight to break through the clouds. It will inevitably happen. Both of these are theories of inevitability, by the way. And so the other option is, rather than to be passive, is to be something of an activist. So if I am a pessimist, but I'm going to choose to be an activist in the face of pessimism, what I'm going to tend to do is take a heroic stance. That the flow of the tide of history is always against me, but I will not be defeated. right? I am unbroken. I am unbeaten. My face may be bloodied, but I'm still the master of my fate and the captain of my soul, even as a tsunami of pessimism sweeps over me. The other way is I'm going to be an activist as an optimist, is to recognize that since history is naturally moving into a positive direction, then that what I can do in the meantime is to give myself to projects that remove the impediments that tend to get in the way of history's flow. And so, see, it's a commitment to views of history and the relation that I take of someone who is suffering relative to those views of history. Now, I know that's very broad, very general. There are exceptions. I get it. Trust me. All right, but I want to say that there's a third alternative here, and that alternative is lament. And that a person who engages in lament is neither committed to this kind of fatalistic negativity, this pessimism in history, nor do they just give themselves to the notion that just every day and every way life is going to get better and better. And if I just stay in there and work to move the impediments, a brighter day will come. Lament is different from either one of those alternatives, because what lament presupposes is not a commitment to history, but a commitment to God. And that history is not just kind of on automatic pilot, but there's a God who is engaged in history, who is going somewhere, who is going to fulfill his ultimate purpose. And that this God is faithful, this God is true, this God is righteousness, he's free, he's sovereign, so he may not always dive through our hoops in the way that we want him to. He may not act in ways that we think he should. You know, as I often say to my congregation, our problem is not that we don't believe that God is faithful and righteousness. Our problem is we're afraid he's not going to show up by Friday at 5. Because we need God to show up by Friday at 5, or we're not going to be able to pay the electric bill, or we're not going to be able to pay the rent, or whatever it is. I need God to show up now. And God is sovereign. God is free. God shows up when God shows up. And when he does show up, as you have often heard, he's always right on time. And so rather than being a commitment to one form of history or the other, as if history is just kind of this dumb process that moves in this or the other particular direction, that instead the commitment is to a living God who is free and who is faithful, and in whom we place our hope. Understand, hope is not simple optimism. Now, I'm not mad at optimism. Optimism has been shown through lots of research to be very good for you in terms of your outlook, in terms of your personal health and everything else. And pessimism is not altogether bad, because we don't want to be just kind of numbskulls who go through life thinking that nothing bad's ever going to happen to us, because bad stuff happens, right? But it's not a commitment to either one of those. Hope for the Christian is to bank one's life, to give one's heart to the notion that the God whom we worship is a God who is faithful, and that he can be trusted even when he doesn't show up on our timetable, or when we want him to, or how we want him to. So those are three different alternatives. And in the face of suffering, see, we don't turn to some vision of history. We turn to the living God, who is free to act. And out of that, see, comes a whole new way of understanding what it means to lament. And so that's what I'll talk about next time. See you. Bye.